Hey, ugly. Your child is as defective as you.
As soon as we reunited for the first time in 13 years, my ex-husband stared us down from head to toe, my daughter and I, who was sitting in the wheelchair I was pushing, before hurling those words at us. I was instantly enraged and about to hurl a barrage of foul language.
What's wrong with my daughter?
The one who spoke up was my current husband, Richard. His deep baritone voice resonated well, not just catching my attention but also turning the heads of those around us. However, I might have been the only one to notice the icy undertone in his voice. Looking back at my ex, Michael, his face had turned pale. My name is Susan. I'm 35 years old. I'm a stay-at-home mom living with my only daughter, Maria, who's 3, and my husband, Richard, who's 3 years younger than me. The house we currently live in was originally built by Richard's parents, but soon after Richard and I got married, his grandmother passed away suddenly. Not wanting to leave his grandfather, who was now living alone in old age, to fend for himself, his parents handed over the house they had been living in to us and moved in with his grandfather. But caring for his grandfather was just one reason. They were probably also worried about Richard, who had just started his own business and wanted to help by giving us a place to live without rent. That was a major factor. I was so grateful for my in-laws' kindness. Until Maria was born, I would visit his grandfather's house every other day to help out with things like hospital visits and housework. After Maria was born, I slowed down a bit, but still made it a point to visit with Richard at least once every 2 weeks. We would help out in any way we could at the time, and sometimes, to give his grandparents a break, we would take care of his grandfather so they could go out and relax at a day spa.
I'm truly grateful for all the help you give, especially during the tough times of parenting.
She's right. Richard really married a wonderful person.
They were always thankful, but to me, no amount of help seemed enough for what Richard's family, including his parents and his twin sister, Emily, had done for me. They had saved my life, not once, but twice. Actually, Richard was my first marriage, but I had been married once before and it had ended in failure. I met my first husband, Michael, right after I had moved to New York for university. We moved into the same apartment complex on the same day. As we settled in, we shared tips about the nearest supermarkets, home improvement stores, and affordable, tasty restaurants, and quickly became friends. Michael attended a prestigious private university known for its stylish campus and frequent media appearances, quite unlike my own, which prided itself on being practical and robust. Michael himself was also tall and slender, and what you would call handsome.
There are a lot of students from metropolitan areas at my university, and people from rural areas like me can hold their heads up. But you and I are in the same boat, Susan. It's more comfortable not having to put on airs.
He would hang out in my apartment so often that eventually, we began living together like a couple. Back then, I couldn't believe I was dating a guy as good-looking as Michael. I might not have the glamour of the female students on Michael's campus, but I can be a place where Michael feels at ease. I would think, naively happy to cook, clean, and do laundry like some kind of housemaid. Of course, no good man would make his partner feel comfortable right from the start of a relationship. That comfort was just shorthand for it's comfortable for the man, a complete self-centeredness. But as they say, love is blind. I completely ignored Michael's selfishness.
If only I could quit my job. The allowance from my parents isn't enough, and my classes are getting harder.
If he said such a thing, why not move to a slightly larger apartment? Don't worry about the rent. I offered that we move into a newly built apartment near the apartment where we met, and that I pay the full rent. Michael, of course, agreed with my proposal, but for some reason, he insisted on keeping both our phone lines separate. When I questioned it,
As soon as I entered high school, my dad got stationed in England, and my mom went with him. They're pretty strict. If it gets out that we're living together, not only will my allowance stop, but I might even be told to drop out of school. You wouldn't like that, would you, Susan? And even Susan's parents, as much as they might expect us to get married eventually, would be saddened to know we're cohabitating.
Michael said with unusual seriousness. At that moment, all I could focus on was the eventually get married part, and I didn't think too deeply about the rest. However, this full-time cohabitation began to weigh heavily on me financially. Since the apartment lease was under my name, I inevitably had to cover not only the rent but also the electricity, gas, water bills, and even the landline and internet fees. Of course, at first, he said, "Since you're covering the rent, I'll pay more for utilities," sounding quite noble.
Sorry, Susan. I'm broke again this month because of social obligations. I need to start considering job hunting soon. So when friends or classmates invite me out for drinks, I find it hard to say no.
I ended up covering everything. I was also paying for groceries. Even the beers Michael drank after his shower came out of my wallet. Michael only contributed to the occasional pizza delivery when his friends came over. And every time he invited friends from his seminar or club to our place, he'd say, if they find out we're living together, they'll tease us for sure. I haven't told them about you, making me leave the apartment for the day. But since I spent all my time outside of university classes working part-time and doing housework, I didn't have a single friend to chat with or hang out with. So I had to spend the night in cafes and chain restaurants. The summer was tough, but waiting on a park swing in the cold winter mornings until I could afford to go home brought me to tears, wondering what I was even doing with my life. By the time we were both in our 4th year of university and seriously job hunting, I finally snapped at Michael, "Contribute a bit to our living expenses. You're practically a freeloader now." He immediately switched to a soothing tone.
Sorry. I was just taking advantage of you. Don't be mad.
He blatantly tried to appease me. The next day, he unexpectedly came to pick me up from my part-time job and clean the apartment, preparing dinner with flowers, wine, and cake he seemed to have gotten from a high-class supermarket. Throughout our long relationship, it was as if, for the first time, I was truly moved by Michael's thoughtfulness, which culminated in him presenting me with a ring from a famous brand at the time.
I can only afford this right now, but someday I'll buy you a diamond worth 3 months of my salary.
I remember the moment he said that and slipped the ring on my finger, feeling the happiest I've ever felt in my life, echoing a line I must have heard somewhere. However, that memory of happiness was the only one of its kind.
I'm torn between getting a job and studying abroad. But if things stay as they are, I'll rely on Susan again. It's a crucial juncture, so I want to try being alone for a while.
He said so and suddenly left me to share an apartment with his friend. I felt anxious, but I managed to hold on since he had some belongings to leave behind, and we still communicated twice a day through emails and calls. I can't mope around. I've got to hustle and find a job too. With that change in spirit, I got an offer from my first choice mid-tier trading company. But around that time, strange calls started coming in on the landline registered under Michael's name. They automatically went to voicemail, and I would absent-mindedly listen to the messages being left, which included unsettling phrases like "it'll be trouble if you don't repay by this week," and "don't take us lightly." I hurriedly contacted Michael's cell phone, but all he said was, "It's nothing, don't worry about it." Eventually, letters with words like collection notice and final warning began to arrive in the mail. I finally confronted him about it.
Stop nagging me already. After all, I've done with an ugly defect like you. The least you can do is pay up.
And just like that, he got mad and stopped answering my calls. Deceived by his constant contact, I was shocked to realize that I hadn't asked Michael for his new address. When I tried asking the university, they told me they couldn't give out that information to someone unrelated, leaving me desperate for any clue. So I started opening the cardboard boxes Michael had left in his room. Inside, I found nothing but documents from various financial companies hinting at debts, old clothes that seemed worthless, and a used-up old laptop. There was nothing about Michael's parents' address in England or any clue about where he might be living now, making me realize I was just a source of money to him. But things got worse. Not long after losing contact with Michael, two men in suits showed up at my apartment, claiming I was Michael's wife and had co-signed his debts, demanding immediate repayment. The additional blow at a time when I hadn't even recovered from the shock of being abandoned by Michael was enough to crush me. What saved me was Richard and his family, who would become my husband. That's why I wanted to do anything I could for my in-laws and husband. However, while pushing my daughter Maria's wheelchair through the mall, I unexpectedly ran into someone. It was Michael, the man who had betrayed and abandoned me 13 years ago. Realizing I was staring in disbelief, he unabashedly ogled both my daughter in the wheelchair and me, then approached us with a distasteful smirk.
Hey, ugly. Your child is as defective as you.
He said, starting off with an insult. The thought that he would insult not only me but my innocent daughter made my blood boil. But then a man stepped suddenly in between us. That was my husband, Richard.
Is there a problem with my daughter?
Richard asked, his clear voice drawing the attention of passersby who stopped to see what was happening. Yet, Michael, faced with Richard's question, turned pale and didn't retort. Maria and I were wondering what was going on and looking back and forth between Michael's and Richard's faces. But Michael, unable to bear the stares of those around him, turned to Richard.
This is a private matter. It's none of your business, is it?
He snapped back. But Richard, without a flicker of emotion, responded.
It is my business, which is why I'm speaking up. Otherwise, I wouldn't bother talking to someone like you.
He said with a snort of laughter.
Mom and Dad have something to do. Your aunt will be here soon to pick you up, so could you go ahead to her house, Maria?
Richard said, smiling at her. Hearing that, I couldn't help but exclaim, "What?" But Maria, mature for her age and not easily startled, remained calm.
Okay, just make sure you come early. It's a celebration, after all.
Soon after, Richard's sister Emily and her kids arrived to pick up Maria, allowing her to leave the scene. Then, Richard's initial momentum was nowhere to be found. He turned to Michael, who was somewhat hesitant.
Let's then move on to an adult conversation. It wouldn't be ideal to provide a free show for the public here, so let's move locations.
Slightly bending over and putting pressure on with a half smile. Michael, not particularly short but still overshadowed by Richard's nearly 6 feet 3 inches tall, agreed more readily than one might expect to change venues, perhaps preferring it to the curious stares of the onlookers. Unexpectedly, he readily agreed to Richard's suggestion and consented to change the location. The three of us took a taxi and arrived at the building where Richard's office was located. Upon pressing the elevator button and seeing the tenant directory next to it, Michael realized they were headed to a law firm, and his face turned pale once again. However, it was too late to run away, and he joined the others in the elevator. Since it was supposed to be Richard's day off, his staff were surprised to see him arrive looking stern with his wife and a guest. By the time they were shown to the back reception room, everyone seemed to have regained their composure. During this time, I managed to calm my own nerves just by looking at Richard's profile. In contrast, Michael was the only one who seemed restless and uneasy. Seeing Michael like this, Richard smirked and asked a staff member to bring over a stack of documents, placing them with a thud beside him.
Well, It's quite the coincidence to meet the person in question before showing these investigation reports to the chairman. It's quite frightening, really.
He casually remarked. Michael's complexion worsened at these words, but unfortunately, I had no idea what he was talking about. Noticing my confusion, Richard began to explain for the benefit of both Michael and myself. The chairman mentioned in the conversation earlier refers to the current chairman of a major machine tool manufacturer, a key client of Richard's office. Recently, the chairman personally summoned him. When Richard visited the head office, he was introduced to the chairman's youngest daughter, who had just returned from graduating from a university in the United States. They asked him to keep this confidential and requested that he conduct a background check on a certain man.
And there you were in the sales department, Mr. Michael Smith. Well, at that time, you introduced yourself with a different spelling in your name as Michael, though, Richard continued, still with a smirk, while Michael's face grew even paler.
As Richard continued to smirk unabatedly, Michael's complexion seemed to worsen even further. Glancing sideways at him, Richard shared a story. The president's granddaughter in New York had pledged her future to an English man she met in graduate school at the same university. This man had dropped out of a university in England just before graduating and moved to the US, where he enrolled in a local university. After finishing his degree, he worked for a while as a local employee but soon got bored and pursued further studies in graduate school. The granddaughter, a smart woman, had fallen deeply in love with this man who had supported her through the culture shock and homesickness after enrolling in a university in New York. Having completed his master's program a bit earlier, they approached her grandfather, the president, asking for his blessing for their marriage and for him to hire the man in his company. It seems the chairman himself had no clue that a man like Michael was hanging around his granddaughter during her stay in New York. However, the chairman's daughter, the executive vice president, had been introduced to the man a few times during their business trips to New York and had even met his parents, who were stationed there. The executive vice president herself thought at the time, "It's not my place to meddle in my adult daughter's love life," but felt it was too sudden when she was asked to marry him and to allow him to join their family-run company as a future executive candidate. So, after a discussion between the doting grandfather and the executive vice president, they decided to ask Richard's law firm, which had ties with their family for generations, to investigate Michael. Upon hearing this, I had a bad feeling. "You don't think that man is Michael, do you?" I asked Richard, looking directly at Michael sitting in front of me.
What's that supposed to mean? Is it bad if it's me? We've been broken up for ages. Who I marry is none of your business.
Michael snapped back even before Richard could respond. Sure, my past with Michael might as well be a dark history, and I've no interest or concern for Michael himself anymore, but I've got a mountain of grievances I'd love to air to him. We broke up, sure, but right before that, you went and filed for marriage without my consent, then made me a co-signer for your debts before skipping town. As I finished yelling, Michael looked momentarily subdued, but then he smirked.
You say that, but you wanted to marry me back then, didn't you? I just made your dream come true and asked for a little help paying off my debts in return.
He said, then nodded towards Richard.
I totally forgot about it because I went on an overseas trip. But when I got back here and checked, I was relieved to find I was single. I thought it was unlikely, but I didn't think anyone else would want someone as ugly and flawed as you. I was worried you'd be waiting for me to come back.
That's when he started talking down to me again. Furious at his condescending tone, I was about to snap again, but Richard, my husband, calmed me down once more.
Geez, I thought you might have learned something from being quiet earlier, but trash will always be trash.
With that, he smoothly began to explain how our marriage was dissolved and Michael was single again. Actually, when Michael disappeared and debt collectors came knocking, the first to offer me advice was Richard's father, my Phil. That's because I was tutoring as a part-time job, and my student at the time was Richard's twin sister, now my Sil, Emily. Emily was smart but was becoming increasingly absent from school due to being ostracized by her classmates. Hired by her worried parents, I learned the ostracism was due to her defending a friend who was also being excluded. I tried to cheer her up with studies and listening to her problems, and soon her parents and grandparents grew fond of me. They started treating me like a family member. Emily and her mother visited me to celebrate her university enrollment when the debt collectors arrived at my apartment. Shocked at my haggard appearance, she became furious upon learning I was tricked into marriage and made a co-signer for debts. Emily immediately contacted her father and grandfather, who brought me to this law firm.
From there, both my father and grandfather pulled out all the stops, running around to resolve the situation. First, they initiated mediation to invalidate the marriage that had been registered without my consent. At the same time, they negotiated with the financial institutions to invalidate my being made a co-signer for the debts. It must have been tough, but my father and grandfather are pretty savvy in this field, so in the end, everything worked out.
But I can only imagine the tremendous effort it took to invalidate the marriage through litigation against Michael, who was not even in the country and whose whereabouts were unknown, and dealing with the stubborn financial institutions was no easy feat. Meanwhile, overwhelmed by this unexpected disaster, dumped by Michael, and all the commotion causing me to graduate from university barely, I wondered how on earth I would afford the attorney's fees after losing the job offer I had secured. That's when my Phil offered me a job at this firm, saying it was okay to work here if I had nowhere else to go. Thinking of it as a way to repay them, I worked tirelessly from morning till night, even on weekends. I intended to pay the attorney's fees out of my installment salary. They received my payment only to the extent that they were not offended by the Bar Association. Thanks to their efforts, the marriage was ultimately annulled, and I was also released from being Michael's co-signer for his debts.
So, strictly speaking, you're not even Susan's ex-husband, just a blot on her life.
Michael, upon hearing this, still seemed to not fully grasp the seriousness of the situation.
Well, having a marriage record with such a woman would be boring anyway. It doesn't matter. Besides, the debt's probably statute barred by now, so it's irrelevant.
He bluffed. But at that moment, Richard burst into laughter.
This statute of limitations hasn't taken effect. I expect the collectors will be visiting you first thing next week.
Facing Michael's bewildered look, Richard dropped this bombshell. Michael himself might have thought, it's already been 13 years, so it's probably statute barred. But thanks to my Phil, after getting me released as a co-signer and the financial institutions unable to find Michael, they came up with a plan. It seems they transferred Michael's debt as it was to a debt collection agency they were in cahoots with. In cases like Michael's, where the debtor attempts to evade repayment or falls behind, making it a bad debt, financial institutions sell these uncollectible debts to debt collection agencies. This process, known as debt assignment, means that from then on, the debt collection, now handled by professionals in collections, becomes the responsibility of these agencies. While they no longer resort to illegal means of collection like in the old days, due to their extensive legal knowledge, it seems they use every possible legal method to recover debts. Naturally, the debt collection agency that purchased Michael's debt was no exception. After proceeding with various legal actions, the judgment from the lawsuit the debt collection agency filed against Michael resulted in the statute of limitations being extended by another 10 years, making the debt fully valid even now. Moreover, the total amount of debt, inflated by accumulated late fees and legal costs, has reportedly skyrocketed to several times the original amount borrowed. Hearing this, Michael momentarily looked disheartened.
I don't care about such money. If I join that company as the CEO's son-in-law, it'll all be manageable.
He retorted, undeterred. Typical shallow Michael. Despite some miscalculations, he undoubtedly assumed that becoming a son-in-law as originally planned and securing a top position in his FIL's company would make repayments seem trivial.
Do you remember what I told you earlier? Who did I say had asked me to investigate you?
Richard said, causing Michael to turn pale this time. Richard is Emily's twin brother, but during my time as Emily's tutor, we hardly spoke, only exchanging greetings when we saw each other. However, Richard became interested in me after hearing his close sister Emily praise me and express her fondness as if I were her sister. Later, unexpectedly, I started working at the office, and Richard, who had passed the bar exam while still in university, taking the fastest route to become a lawyer, and I began working together at the office. When Richard offered me I wanted to date with marriage in mind, I explained my past and refused, saying it wouldn't be fair to my benefactor-in-laws. However, Richard said he knew all about my situation with Michael from the beginning and still wanted to marry me, and he convinced me that all in-laws support us being a couple. By then, my parents back in my small town, who knew about my situation and were concerned for my future, had also given us their blessing, and Richard and I were happily married. Unlike me, who had intended to seal away my past as a dark chapter, Richard had secretly harbored a desire for revenge against Michael for years. Then a request from the chairman arrived, and at first, I thought it was someone with the same name, but upon closer investigation, I discovered that the chairman's daughter's boyfriend, Michael Smith, was the same Michael Smith who had discarded me like trash. I was about to submit a report based on this discovery first thing next week.
I guess he thought he could hide it because the spelling is different. So when the chairman's granddaughter saw your driver's license and pointed out the difference in spelling, you made up some story about being told this version of the name is Lakir, right? But in reality, you were trying to cover up your many indiscretions. After all, Smith is the most common surname. You were planning to just claim it was a case of two people with the same name if anything bad happened, weren't you?
When he said that, he sharply retorted, "Don't think such shallow tricks will work on a lawyer." I had already asked the secretary to scan the report and had emailed it to the chairman and his granddaughter. Adding further,
Since then, that finance company has occasionally sent inquiries to our office about whether they had tracked you down. So, I took the liberty of informing them about you as well.
laughing genuinely with delight, Michael suddenly collapsed to his knees.
Please, somehow convince them it was all a mistake.
He began to cry, begging the chairman and others to intercede for him. But Richard, with a mocking smile, showed no sympathy.
Why should I, as a lawyer, have to do something as morally reprehensible as telling such blatant lies to a client, especially to someone who has shown kindness, let alone to a young girl in a wheelchair who you've insulted as ugly and defective?
I firmly told Michael. The truth is, my daughter Maria got injured on her way to violin lessons when I took my eyes off her for a moment, and a high school student looking at their phone bumped into her, causing her to fall. Since then, worried about Maria, who tends to get withdrawn, Emily and her kids, knowing she won an art contest, suggested we celebrate. And today, because of Michael, what was supposed to be a joyous occasion turned into a disaster. Richard, utterly enamored with his daughter, must have been furious, not just because of Michael's past shame, but also his vile words towards Maria. Despite being coldly treated by Richard, Michael shamelessly bawled, begging, "Please, A man's future is at stake here. Are you going to ruin it? As he desperately clung on.
Ruin someone's life? Who are you to say such a thing? The very thing you planned to do to Susan and the chairman's granddaughter was exactly that, ruining someone else's life. What goes around comes around, a giant boomerang coming right back at you. You just have to accept it.
Richard declared, brushing off Michael's attempts to cling further.
The exit is that way.
We called the building security to promptly escort Michael out of the office. As we heard Michael's crying and bitter laments fade away, Richard and I exchanged glances and shared a smile. Afterward, Michael rushed to his girlfriend, the chairman's granddaughter, making excuses. But she had already begun to harbor suspicions against him. The revelation of the truth only fueled her anger, leading her to decisively cut ties with him, refusing to see him again. However, the chairman and the executive vice president, seeing their beloved daughter and granddaughter hurt, were not content to let it end there. Michael, who had tried to reconcile by persistently following her and bombarding her with messages and emails, was reported to the police for suspicion of fraud for attempting to marry and infiltrate the company with a fake resume. Although it didn't escalate to a criminal case, a warning was issued for his stalking behavior. Still, his refusal to give up and multiple instances of stalking eventually led to his arrest and prosecution. He was sentenced to jail time, though he received probation. Once released on bail, he appeared to return to a normal life on the surface, but with a criminal record. He found it impossible to find employment anywhere outside of New York. Desperate, Michael attempted to move to England for work, but his criminal record hindered his visa application, forcing him to abandon the plan. Moreover, after his parents learned everything from the chairman and the police, they disowned him, leaving Michael truly alone. With debts looming and blacklisted from most employment, unable to even own a smartphone or renew his expired driver's license, Michael had no choice but to take any job he could get. Rumor has it, he now works for a handyman service introduced by debt collectors, living in a dorm with no privacy, working tirelessly from dawn till dusk. However, this was none of my concern, and I chose to forget about it as soon as I heard. On the other hand, Richard and I moved to an apartment near the private elementary school Maria would attend, as soon as her injury had fully healed. Ever since that incident, Maria has been hesitant to take the train, so she's been happy with the bus commute and loves the view from our high-rise apartment, seeming joyful every day. When Richard suggested selling our previous home, which was a renovated gift from my in-laws, and moving to an apartment, I was worried about what my in-laws would think. However, after they passed their house to us and started enjoying their second life in a warm coastal town, they reassured us.
What's best for your son, his wife, and our granddaughter is the most important, so don't worry about it.
In fact, they encouraged us.
Being closer to my workplace means more time with family than before, and it was definitely a good decision.
Richard seems to be enjoying the new life as much as Maria. Seeing them both so happy, I've been inspired to try something new myself.